This episode, inspired by a question from one of our loyal listeners, explores why many countries hesitate to increase aid to Gaza. Issues like aid diversion, security risks, and political challenges reveal the complex realities behind the global response.
Welcome back, everybody, to another deep dive. Today we're going to be talking about an issue that's been in the news a lot lately. And frankly, it's one that a lot of folks find really confusing.
It definitely is. And it's something that deserves a lot more attention and nuance than it usually gets.
Right, exactly. And, we're seeing these heartbreaking images from Gaza. The need is so obvious, so desperate. But then you hear about all these complications with getting aid there. And it's like, why is it so hard to just help people?
Well, that's exactly what we're going to unpack today. We've got a ton of reports, articles, firsthand accounts. And the goal here is to really understand the obstacles to getting aid to Gaza. And trust me, there are a lot more than you might think.
Yeah, and I think one of the first things that struck me as we were going through all this material is just the sheer scale of the need. It's hard to even wrap your head around.
Absolutely. Like, even before this recent conflict escalated, we're talking about almost 1 million children in Gaza who were already dependent on aid. That's like half of all the kids there.
Half? Wow. That's just mind-boggling. And then you layer on top of that the displacement from the recent fighting.
It's a humanitarian crisis on a scale that's really hard to comprehend. And it creates this incredibly complex situation for countries who are trying to help. Because it's not just about good intentions, it's about navigating a minefield of risks and challenges.
And I think that's where a lot of the reluctance comes from, right?
Yeah.
It's not that people don't care. It's that the situation on the ground is so volatile and unpredictable.
Exactly. Like, one of the first big hurdles you encounter is just the sheer danger of trying to get aid into Gaza.
Yeah, one of the UNICEF reports described aid convoys literally coming under fire. Like, imagine trying to deliver life-saving supplies while you're dodging bullets.
And it's not just an isolated incident. The World Health Organization has documented a truly alarming number of attacks on healthcare facilities.
Ambulances, hospitals, clinics.
All under threat. It's like trying to put out a fire while someone keeps attacking the fire station.
It just seems so counterproductive. Like, everyone loses in that scenario.
Right. And it's not just about the physical danger either. There's also the incredible risk that aid workers are taking. These are people who are often facing the same horrors as everyone else in Gaza. They're losing homes, families, loved ones.
But they're still showing up every day to try and make a difference.
It's an incredible testament to their courage and dedication. But it also highlights the human cost of this conflict. It's not just numbers on a page. It's real people risking their lives to help others.
And when you factor in that level of danger, I can definitely see why some countries might be hesitant to get involved.
It's like asking someone to walk into a burning building without any protective gear. You can't really blame them for having second thoughts.
But let's say for a moment that the aid does actually make it through the conflict zone. The challenges don't end there, right?
Oh, absolutely not. In fact, that's really just the beginning. The logistical nightmare of actually getting aid to those who need it is enormous, even when everyone has the best intentions.
It's like a perfect storm of obstacles.
Well,
One of the reports mentioned just the basic lack of resources. Like, there aren't enough trucks to transport the aid. And even if you do find a truck, there's not enough fuel to run it.
it's a logistical bottleneck that even the most well-funded organizations struggle to overcome.
And then even if you manage to secure transportation,
Yeah.
you've got all these bureaucratic hurdles to jump through.
Oh, yeah, the paperwork, the inspections, the endless waiting, it's enough to drive anyone crazy. And UNICEF was highlighting how essential items, things like generators and water pipes, they often get held up in these processes for absolutely no reason.
It's bureaucracy at its worst. And it's happening while people's lives are literally hanging in the balance.
The frustration must be incredible for the aid workers who are trying to get these supplies to the people who need them.
And then let's not forget about the situation inside Gaza itself.
Right. Even when you finally get the aid into the territory, you've still got to figure out how to distribute it.
And with all the damage to the infrastructure, you're like, the bombed roads, unexploded bombs, it's got to be incredibly difficult.
You've got entire communities that have been displaced, people on the move. It's a recipe for chaos.
It's like trying to deliver a pizza in the middle of an earthquake, even with the best intentions in the world. It's just not going to be easy.
And then you add on top of that the communication blackouts that frequently happen in Gaza. It becomes almost impossible to coordinate relief efforts.
So you're trying to deliver aid in a war zone with limited resources, damaged infrastructure, and no way to communicate effectively. It's no wonder that countries might start to have doubts.
It's a completely understandable reaction. The risks are immense, the challenges are overwhelming, and it's hard to know if your efforts are actually making a difference.
So we've already seen just how difficult it is to get aid into Gaza and distribute it effectively. But there's another layer of complexity here that we need to address.
A layer that makes a lot of countries hesitant to even get involved in the first place.
And that's the very real concern, that even if the aid does reach Gaza, it might not actually end up in the right hands.
That's right. It's something that a lot of people don't want to talk about, but the reality is that sometimes, even when aid gets to Gaza, it doesn't end up helping those who need it most.
Yeah, we saw several reports about looting, and it sounds like it's not just a few isolated incidents either.
Right. It's organized, it's violent, and it's happening on a scale that's really alarming.
It's just heartbreaking to think about supplies that were meant for families who are struggling to survive end up in the hands of criminals.
It really undermines the entire aid effort, and it puts the people who are trying to deliver those supplies at risk, too.
Yeah, one of the things that really stuck with me was the statistic about the drivers transporting these aid convoys.
The IDF has reported that on average, at least one driver is shot each day in Gaza.
Shot by looters.
By looters, it's just insane.
It makes you wonder how sustainable this whole system can be when just transporting the aid becomes a life or death situation.
It casts this huge shadow of uncertainty over the entire process. You know, the IDF mentioned that over 1,100 aid trucks entered Gaza in December.
But there's no way to know how many of them actually reach their destinations.
Exactly. And that uncertainty is devastating for the families who are relying on the supplies.
It's like this awful lottery, hoping that the truck with the aid you desperately need doesn't get hijacked along the way.
It's a terrifying reality for a lot of people.
So we've got the dangers on the ground, the logistical nightmares, and then there's this whole other layer of concern that makes countries really hesitant to send aid in the first place.
The concern that even if the aid does get to Gaza, it might not be used for humanitarian purposes.
You mean the possibility that it could end up being used by Hamas for military purposes?
That's right. It's a really sensitive issue, but it's something that we need to talk about because there's evidence that it's happening.
We saw reports about water pipes that were intended for sanitation being converted into rocket launchers.
And aid bags being used as sandbags.
It's just mind-blowing to think that good intentions can backfire in such a horrific way.
The Washington Examiner actually highlighted that Hamas has released videos boasting about these tactics.
So it's not even a secret.
Not at all.
It's got to create this incredible dilemma for countries who are trying to decide whether to send aid.
Absolutely. You want to help those in need, but you also don't want to inadvertently fuel the conflict.
And it seems like some countries have decided that the risk is just too great.
We saw that Britain, Germany, Italy, they've all halted funding to UNRWA.
Which is the main UN agency providing aid in Gaza.
Right. And these are major donors.
It's a huge blow to the aid effort.
It really is. And it signals this growing distrust in the traditional aid model.
Like just throwing money at the problem isn't working.
Exactly. And it raises the question, if the existing channels for aid are so problematic, what are the alternatives?
That's the million-dollar question. And it's one that we're going to explore in more depth when we come back. Okay, so we've talked about all the reasons why sending aid to Gaza is so risky. You've got the dangers on the ground, the logistical headaches, the concerns about aid being misused. It kind of makes you wonder, are there any other options out there?
It's a tough question. You know, is there a way to help the people of Gaza without making the conflict worse?
Right, like how do you break that cycle?
No, it's definitely not easy. There's no magic solution. But there are people who are trying to come up with some new approaches.
Approaches that focus on more long-term solutions.
Exactly. Like instead of just putting a Band-Aid on the problem, how do we address the root causes?
One of the things that came up a lot in the reports we read was the idea of easing the restrictions on commercial goods.
Right now, Gaza is almost entirely dependent on aid. And that creates all sorts of problems.
Like it makes them vulnerable to political pressure.
Yeah.
It makes it harder to build a sustainable economy.
Exactly. It's like they're stuck in this constant state of emergency.
And so the idea is if you can ease those restrictions, allow businesses to operate more freely, encourage investment.
Then you start to create the conditions for real long-term growth.
So instead of just handing out food and water, you're helping people to build their own futures.
You're giving them the tools to be self-sufficient.
It makes a lot of sense. But even if you can solve the economic piece of this puzzle, there's still this massive elephant in the room.
The political conflict between Israel and Palestine.
That's the root of the problem, isn't it?
It's like trying to fix a broken leg while someone keeps kicking you in the shin.
Ouch.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good analogy.
As long as that conflict is going on, any progress you make is going to be fragile. at best.
So it sounds like alongside these efforts to address the humanitarian crisis and the economic challenges,
There needs to be a real push for a lasting political solution.
which is obviously easier said than done.
It's going to take a lot of hard work and compromise on all sides.
And there's no guarantee of success.
But if you want to see a real change in Gaza, that's where the focus needs to be.
And speaking of changing the way we think about things, one of the most interesting arguments we came across was the idea that international aid might actually be part of the problem.
Yeah, that was a pretty provocative take.
I think it was Michael Rubin who wrote about this in the Washington Examiner.
And his point was basically that by constantly bailing out Hamas, the international community is actually enabling them to stay in power.
And it's preventing them from having to take responsibility for the well-being of their own people.
It's like giving an addict their drug of choice.
It keeps them dependent, and it stops them from hitting rock bottom and maybe finally making a change.
It's a pretty harsh analogy, but I think it gets the point across.
And it really makes you question whether the current aid model is actually helping the Palestinian people in the long run.
It's a tough question, and there's no easy answer.
But I think it highlights how important it is to be really critical of the way we approach aid in conflict zones.
And to make sure that our efforts are actually aligned with our goals.
So where does all of this leave us? We have unpacked a ton of information about why it's so hard to get aid to Gaza. We've talked about the dangers, the logistics, the concerns about misuse.
And even the possibility that aid itself might be contributing to the problem.
It's a lot to wrap your head around.
It is. It's a complex situation with no easy solutions.
But I think the fact that we're having these difficult conversations is a good sign.
It means that we haven't given up hope.
And that we're still searching for a better way.
We need to move beyond the blame game and the simplistic solutions.
And really embrace the complexity of this issue.
And most importantly, we need to remember that behind all the headlines and the statistics, there are real people whose lives are at stake.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I think the main takeaway is that supporting Gaza is not just about writing a check.
It's about demanding better solutions.
It's about holding everyone accountable.
And it's about finding ways to empower the Palestinian people.
So that they can build a better future for themselves.
It's a long road ahead.
But it's a journey worth taking.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
We hope this has given you some new insights into this really important issue.
And maybe even a bit of hope that we can find a better way forward.
Thanks for listening.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of In the Know News. We hope this discussion helped unpack the complexities of international aid to Gaza. We'd love to hear your thoughts. What do you think about the global response to this crisis? Drop your comments below and share your perspective. If you found this episode valuable, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Stay curious, stay informed, and we'll see you next time.